health, because then you're sitting there going, okay, am I overqualified? Do I need to be looking for lower jobs? Do I need to be considering taking less money? Do I need to be considering taking entry-level jobs? Do I need to consider a career switch? And then you kind of get into analysis paralysis, where you're asking yourself all these questions because nothing seems to be working, and you don't really know which way you want to go, because you're like, well, I don't necessarily want to pursue more education. I don't necessarily want to pursue a whole different career path. I don't really want to take less money than I was making 2.5, 3 years ago. All these kinds of things. And then, of course, you're a father, you're a husband. You want to provide for your family. Some of, the money you had saved up or severance package that you got starts running out, and, it gets stressful.
You spoke about being overqualified. You had those thoughts of being overqualified. I feel like, just general thing here in South Africa, I feel like that's another pandemic, because as much as we keep on studying, there will come a point where, as the company that is hiring ends up not hiring because of being overqualified, you thinking that you will get more chances of being hired through spending much time in time and money in education, only to realize that you've made the loss. You started to not find a solution. And I just want to touch on the fact that being the head of a family, being a breadwinner and not having a job, of struggling or finding a job. And sometimes we have that thing. You spoke about the thoughts of deciding of taking the lesser option that you told yourself, because that you believe that you valued this amount of money and this amount of in this specific job, and it might have, it could, I can only imagine that it was hard. What coping mechanism did you tend to, and how did they ultimately become negative?
Sorry, what kind of coping mechanisms did I use?
Yeah.
Well, I tried to use logic as much as possible. So when I was offered some jobs, I would have to, let's say I was offered a job and it was making, let's say, $10,000 less than I was making before. But it was also this kind of hey, you're asking me to move 5 hours away from where I currently am, where my family is, where my daughter goes to school. And you're also asking me to move further away from our family that we visit, that's a couple hours away. And you're considering me, I would have to take my daughter out of school and put her in a new school. And so logic was kind of my coping. And in terms of thinking something through and going and trying not necessarily to be desperate to take something, that just because I needed money. And, that was kind of the struggle too, because, when you think about being overqualified, you're looking at, let's say I could take a entry-level job at a restaurant, but really, restaurants don't want to hire somebody with a master's degree to run a register or to wait tables. So it's kind of this thing of, in a way, part of it was okay, you have to be logical and go and try not to think in desperation of like, hey, I just need money. I'll do anything. I'll lower my standards or I'll take something I don't want. You really have to look at it and go, okay, like these kind of people are not going to hire me. So it doesn't matter. There's no point in applying to those kinds of jobs. And then the other ones were, it just wasn't going to be good for myself or my family. It wasn't going to be a future I wanted. And so, using that logic kind of allowed me to sit and think through viable options of how I was going to provide and make some money. And, eventually kind of what I settled on was Ubering, because it allowed me to stay where I was. It allowed me to make some instant money, but it also allowed me the freedom to, not have to relocate, not necessarily have to clock in and out of an organization. It just kind of allowed me to do everything to do something temporarily while I continued to search for something that was more meaningful. So,
actually, I want to shift this perspective into podcasting, and as much as a fellow podcast host and founder, and I did have problems when it came to mental health also, and that time was when I started this podcast was back in COVID, the start of COVID, I think so, yeah. And I really had problems with mental health, and I couldn't. I was a bit skeptical in terms of the counseling that they offered here at school, university, and I couldn't understand why would you go to therapy. And also I didn't have knowledge on that, so I started doing research on entire mental health and decided, no, there are people out there who talk about mental health, people out there who are struggling, people out there who are struggling also with mental health, depression, as to be specific. And I realized that I'm not alone, and so my pain is nothing compared to others, what I had spoken when I started this podcast. And to me, I found healing through this podcast. So in terms of shifting from actual work and doing podcasting, how did that change your whole perspective in terms of searching for job and in terms of mental health in general?
Well, it's kind of taken me some time to figure out all this, and I almost feel like I'm still learning and figuring out all this, because what I didn't mention also in the same process as you were talking about it, I remember listening to one of your episodes, and during this time, also both my grandparents had passed away, and then also some of the nurses I used to manage had passed away, and so that was also a big struggle in terms of mental health. And it was probably after, I would say, about 3 years, 2.5 to 3 years of, I would go on these job searches, I would do 100%, put out a bunch of applications, wait, interview, turn down, whatever, and just nothing. And I think at some point I just said, I don't want to go back in healthcare. Why am I applying for jobs I don't even want? Why am I applying for stuff that I'm turning down? Why am I putting all this effort into it? I felt like I had to do it, let's say for my family or discussions with my wife, but I really didn't want to do it. and nothing was happening. So I think at some point it's kind of like this, you knock on a door, and if it doesn't open, you knock on the next door, and you keep knocking till doors open. But then there's also this whole thing of going like, if you're headed in the right direction, if you feel spiritually, emotionally, the universe, God, however you want to put it in context, whatever you want to call it, that when you're headed in the right direction, that the right doors will open, the right things will happen. And, I had put in so much effort into these other jobs, into finding another job, and nothing was happening. So, my dad was like, maybe you should start a podcast. And I considered it. And then I was actually applying back to the company that I got laid off from. And my daughter, my 10-year-old daughter, was like sitting there while I was filling out the application and was like, are you sure you want to do that? Do you want 2 a.m. phone calls again? Blah, blah, blah. She said, why don't you start a podcast? And so then I considered it. And then once I heard this podcast on Spotify for podcasters, I saw that the barrier to entry was a lot lower than I initially perceived. So then I kind of thought of a concept. I recorded an episode, and then I had trouble kind of being consistent with it. But whenever there was some sort of point in there that I decided I need to be doing this every week. And when I decided that, I would say that things shifted for me. Doors started to open for me. And, I don't want to downplay the difficulty of how my mental health was doing then, because while it was kind of improving, because I was kind of focused on something and moving towards something, my mental health, there was still a lot of a fault in my confidence. I had a lot of doubt. I didn't know that I could do this. I didn't know that I was on the right track. And so it was kind of through a series of processes. And once I started that, and then I kind of became connected with the Podcast Connection Network that I'm part of now. And having somebody else tell me, oh, I like what you're doing, and then kind of joining a group and then learning more about podcasting and having an accountability group and people you can learn from. And while it's still been difficult, I would say it's been constantly improving. And so, mentally, in terms of mental health, yes, it's still been difficult, but I would say I still have some lows. But in terms of starting the podcast and kind of progressing with the podcast, I've definitely had higher highs, and I feel like I'm at least headed in the right direction. And I feel a little bit more like who I'm supposed to be and true to myself, and like I'm not having to not be something I'm not, or apply to jobs I don't want. I essentially kind of, the buck stops with me, and I get to do whatever it is I want, how I want. And, so it's been empowering, but it's still difficult, and I still have hard times and self-doubt and imposter syndrome. And even though it gets better and you do better and, you create better episodes, your editing gets better, still sometimes find yourself going, oh, I'm actually doing this.
Actually, I can relate with towards that, because when I started this podcast, I was scared of talking into the microphone. My audio was bad. I didn't edit. I was terrible at editing. And through doing graphics, I was bad in terms of logos. I didn't understand why should I create a logo. There's so many things that I didn't understand. And also to agree with you in terms of being consistent.